Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics, where we'll be bringing you live coverage from the City of London of Theresa May's speech on Brexit and the UK's future relationship with the EU. We're promised it will contain a lot of detail and some hard truths. But will it be enough to satisfy her critics at home and unlock negotiations with Brussels? Welcome to the show. We're expecting the Prime Minister to begin speaking shortly. She arrived at the Mansion House a short while ago. That's the home and office of the Lord Mayor of London. She was meant to be delivering this speech in Newcastle, but, unsurprisingly, the bad weather put paid to that. Well, I'm joined here today by two MPs who are very keen to hear what she's got to say, and they've got very different views on Brexit. They are the Conservative MP Am Trevelyan and the Labour MP Emma Reynolds. Welcome to both of you. Thank you. Now, we've been told that Mrs May has set 5 tests for a future trade deal with the EU. So what are they? Well, she'll say the deal must respect the result of the 2016 EU referendum, provide a lasting solution that will endure for years. She'll say the deal must protect jobs and security in the UK and the EU, maintain the UK as a modern, outward-looking, tolerant European democracy. And she say it must strengthen, not weaken, the ties between the 4 nations of the UK. Am Trevelyan, what do you want to hear her say?
I think to reiterate those things is great. They're a very clear direction. What we saw earlier this week as the EU's kind of attempt at an agreement which had in it this rather, sort of shocking suggestion that somehow Northern Ireland should be annexed to the rest of Ireland. That sort of tone was completely wrong. So to hear her really be able to set out very clearly how we see our framework as a nation going forward, of 4 nations together, is very important to me, and making sure that we've got that clarity, that separation away from the single market and the customs union.
What do you want to hear her say?
I want her to explain how, if we're not going to stay in the customs union, the government are going to avoid a visible border, a real border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because that is a very difficult issue, and I don't think the government have grappled with that yet. And I also want her to show some real leadership and be clear about what the government wants rather than what it doesn't want, because they haven't done that yet. Am
Trevelyan, the Prime Minister, and certainly billing for this speech, has been all about trying to heal divisions, bring the 2 sides together, reach out to European partners. Give me one compromise you would be prepared to make to break the impasse.
If we needed to pay more money to help them balance their books for a bit longer.
So more than the £40 billion that has been agreed?
Yes, I'm not terribly happy with that number, but honestly, if in order to get over, because I think one of the real challenges that the EU has is that we stepping away leaves them with a financial challenge for the beginning of that. So if we have to help them to ease that, honestly, I would live with that as a Brexiteer.
Right. Theresa May, your colleague, your Brexiteer colleague, said that parts of the speech may make her feel uncomfortable. Do you share that sentiment?
Well, I hope not. I hope that they will be very clear. But if there are some, I think the point is that we want to move forward. The end state for me is where we get to, which is out of the EU, so that we are genuinely a sovereign state and able to make decisions for ourselves. That's what I'm looking for. Am
Trevelyan says that actually the government should be prepared to pay more in order to get something back from the EU. What compromise would you make as a Remain MP?
With the government or with the EU?
No, with the government in terms of its offer to the EU to unlock these negotiations.
Well, what I would like to see the government do is stop talking about the parties' machinations and actually start talking about what's in the best interest of the country, what's in the best interest of constituents of mine, jobs, investment, and what on earth does the government actually want from these negotiations rather than what it doesn't want, because all we've heard so far is red lines, we've heard sound bites, we've heard Brexit means Brexit. We haven't had a clear vision of what Brexit really will look like under this government, and we have not really had the government taking on board that the EU27 all have different priorities. They've been more so looking over their shoulders to their backbenchers and trying to negotiate with them and other members of the cabinet.
But you haven't said what you would compromise on. In terms of what you believe would be the best form of Brexit, what would you give way on in order to unlock what have been very difficult negotiations between the EU and the government? Are you prepared to move?
Well, I would say to the EU, I want the closest possible economic partnership with you, and that would, as Jeremy Corbyn set out this week, mean staying in the customs union, which would give the EU more clout and power in negotiations with third countries. I think that's something that is worth doing.
You said the EU had made a rather shocking announcement in terms of its draft proposals. Do you think they have overreached themselves in terms of the tone of these negotiations?
Well, I used to buy and sell companies for a living. I did trade negotiations. That's what you do. You present your favourite position and then you work towards somewhere in the middle ground. So if that was clearly their preferred position, I was quite surprised that they were going to start at that point. But honestly, we're not going anywhere near that. That's unacceptable to the British people and to the Northern Irish residents. So we need something. Well, but I was just quite surprised that they started that far, you know, along the continuum in that position.
But there's a reason for that, because the three options as laid out in December, the government has done nothing on the first two options to lay out exactly how that would work and how that would avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland.
All right, let's talk to our correspondent Alex Forsyth while we wait for the Prime Minister to get to the podium at Mansion House for that speech. Alex Forsyth, this is not going to be a speech that is going to answer all the questions or solve all the issues and problems that exist. So what's the best that people can hope for?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, there is so much in this complex negotiation which cannot possibly be resolved in one 30-minute or so speech by the Prime Minister. So I think what the real ambition of this speech is, and what the test of its success will be, is whether or not this does enough to convince her counterparts in Brussels that Theresa May has some sort of credible plan for Brexit, rooted in reality rather than just rhetoric, because we have heard, of course, from senior figures, Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for the EU, Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, who suggested that there needs to be an inject of reality in Theresa May's ambition, that she can't just keep saying she wants a bespoke deal. She has to flesh out how, in practice, she thinks she might achieve it. So no, we're not going to get huge amounts of detail. It's more going to be a persuasion that she has got something to offer, so they can move the talks on to the crucial issue of trade. And if you think back to the last two speeches that she gave, the original speech that she made in Lancaster House when she set out the premise of what she wanted to achieve from Brexit, and then again when she went to Florence to give a speech there, they did play a part in unblocking negotiations at a time when everybody was feeling pretty dismal about the process. And I think that is what she'll be hoping to achieve from today. And of course, alongside that, that tricky job of keeping her own party and the different elements within it on side too.
All right, Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Of course, you'll be watching the speech along with the rest of us. Let's go back to Mansion House. Let's see the gathering of journalists there as they wait for Theresa May to make this third Brexit speech following Lancaster House and the Florence speech. Apparently, Boris Johnson, who was supposed to be there, the Foreign Secretary, but he's been snowed in Budapest. I don't know whether that will come as a disappointment or relief to the Prime Minister, but everybody else is gathered there. We're told it's going to be about 45 minutes. There's the Bank of England Governor there, Mark Carney, coming in, and various other officials. And I think we're expecting her probably to take to her feet in the next few moments. And as I say, it will be about 45 minutes. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, a former Prime Minister, John Major, intervened this week. He said he didn't want to undermine the Prime Minister, but Bernard Jenkin, your colleague, has called him an enemy of democracy. How do you view him?
I perhaps wouldn't use such harsh words, but his position seems to certainly be on the preference to stay in and the feeling that the British people's choice to go for Brexit wasn't one that he agreed with, and he continues to push the alternate line, which is, honestly, from my point of view, more than anything else, it's frustrating because, you know, if we believe in democracy and a majority outcome, the one we follow, then Brexit is what we're doing. Right,
we can just see members of the Cabinet who have actually made it there, the Brexit Secretary and Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, and, of course, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. One of the issues, of course, has been getting the Cabinet to broadly agree to what was going to be said in this speech today. Again, from what you're hearing, are your Brexit colleagues happy with what is going to be said from what they know?
From the conversations I've had this week, there seems to be a really upbeat feel, actually, to last week's meetings, and the fact that I think everyone's moving in the same direction. I think the honesty is that sense of understanding that it is what the British people majority asked for, and therefore we must deliver it and find a way forwards which works for everybody.
Right, and is that because you believe that actually further down the line, post the transition agreement, if and when that is signed off, that there would be an opportunity to perhaps change and fully diverge from the EU once that implementation period is over?
Well, once we're a sovereign state once more, and I don't know, 10, 15 years down the line, we will be an independent nation moving forwards, hopefully with a good free trade arrangement with our EU partners and with others, and we will continue to develop, and our businesses and our trade skills will grow as they have done over hundreds of years.
And change what's agreed now?
Well, it'll move forward. So free trade agreements do get added to with other nations now. There's no reason why that mightn't happen. But that's the point of being independent and able to move forwards in a cohesive fashion.
The transition might last for 10 or 15 years. Sorry.
No. The other side. No, please, no. That I would not be happy with. I think Theresa May and I would both be very unhappy with that.
Right. I mean, if you think about the way the EU has behaved this week, do you think there is a risk of pushing too far and too hard and actually stiffening the resolve of the government?
I think that from the EU's point of view, they had this agreement in December and they needed it to be fleshed out. But I think we're going to...
There's the applause for Theresa May as she begins her third Brexit speech at Mansion House. The Prime Minister.
Well, good afternoon, and I'm grateful to the Lord Mayor and all his team at the Mansion House for hosting us this afternoon. And in the midst of the bad weather, I'd just like to take a moment before I begin my speech today to thank everyone in our country who is going the extra mile to help people at this time. I think of our emergency services and armed forces working to keep people safe, our NHS staff, care workers, and all those keeping our public services going, and the many volunteers who are giving their time to help those in need. Your contribution is a special part of who we are as a country, and it's all the more appreciated at a moment like this. Now, I'm here today to set out my vision for the future economic partnership between the United Kingdom and the European Union. There have been many different voices and views in the debate on what our new relationship with the EU should look like, and I've listened carefully to them all. But as we chart our way forward with the EU, I want to take a moment to look back. 18 months ago, I stood in Downing Street and addressed the nation for my first time as Prime Minister. I made this pledge then to the people that I serve. I know you're working around the clock, I know you're doing your best, and I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. We will do everything we can to give you more control over your lives. When we take the big calls, we'll think not of the powerful, but you. When we pass new laws, we'll listen not to the mighty, but to you. When it comes to taxes, we'll prioritise not the wealthy, but you. When it comes to opportunity, we won't entrench the advantages of the fortunate few. We will do everything we can to help anybody, whatever your background, to go as far as your talents will take you. We are living through an important moment in our country's history. As we leave the European Union, we will forge a bold new positive role for ourselves in the world, and we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. That pledge to the people of our United Kingdom is what guides me in our negotiations with the EU. And for me, that means 5 things. First, the agreement we reach with the EU must respect the referendum. It was a vote to take control of our borders, laws and money, and a vote for wider change, so that no community in Britain would ever be left behind again. But it was not a vote for a distant relationship with our neighbours. Second, the new agreement we reach with the EU must endure. After Brexit, both the UK and the EU want to forge ahead with building a better future for our people, not find ourselves back at the negotiating table because things have broken down. Third, it must protect people's jobs and security. People in the UK voted for our country to have a new and different relationship with Europe. But while the means may change, our shared goals surely have not: to work together to grow our economies and keep our people safe. Fourth, it must be consistent with the kind of country we want to be as we leave: a modern, open, outward-looking, tolerant European democracy. A nation of pioneers, innovators, explorers and creators. A country that celebrates our history and diversity, confident of our place in the world. That meets its obligations to our near neighbours and far-off friends, and is proud to stand up for its values. And fifth, in doing all of these things, it must strengthen our union of nations and our union of people. We must bring our country back together, taking into account the views of everyone who cares about this issue from both sides of the debate. As Prime Minister, it is my duty to represent all of our United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, north and south, from coastal towns and rural villages to our great cities. So these are the 5 tests for the deal that we will negotiate. Implementing the decision of the British people, reaching an enduring solution, protecting our security and prosperity, delivering an outcome that is consistent with the kind of country we want to be, and bringing our country together, strengthening the precious union of all our people. We are now approaching a crucial moment. There is no escaping the complexity of the task ahead of us. We must not only negotiate our exit from an organisation that touches so many important parts of our national life, we must also build a new and lasting relationship while, given the uncertainty inherent in this negotiation, preparing for every scenario. But we are making real progress. At the end of last year, we agreed the key elements of our withdrawal. We are in the process of turning that agreement into draft legal text. We've made clear our concerns about the first draft the Commission published on Wednesday, but no one should be in any doubt about our commitment to the joint report we agreed in December. We are close to agreement on the terms of an implementation period, which was a key element of December's deal. Of course, some points of difference remain, but I'm confident these can be resolved in the days ahead. Both the UK and the EU are clear. This implementation period must be time-limited and cannot become a permanent solution. But it is vital to give governments, businesses and citizens on both sides the time they need to prepare for our new relationship. With this agreed, I want both sides to turn all our attention and efforts to that new relationship. But before we can do that, we need to set out in more detail what relationship we want, building on my Lancaster House and Florence speeches. So last month, I spoke in Munich about the security partnership we seek. And today I want to talk about the other pillar of that relationship, how we build our economic partnership. In my speech in Florence, I set out why the existing models for economic partnership either do not deliver the ambition we need or impose unsustainable constraints on our democracy. For example, the Norway model, where we would stay in the single market, would mean having to implement new EU legislation automatically and in its entirety, and would also mean continued free movement. Others have suggested we negotiate a free trade agreement similar to that which Canada has recently negotiated with the EU, or trade on World Trade Organization terms. But these options would mean a significant reduction in our access to each other's markets compared to that which we currently enjoy. And this would mean customs and regulatory checks at the border that would damage the integrated supply chains that our industries depend on, and be inconsistent with the commitments that both we and the EU have made in respect of Northern Ireland. This is a wider issue in our negotiations, and I want to dwell on this for a minute. Successive British governments have worked tirelessly, together with all the parties in Northern Ireland and with the Irish government, to bring about the historic achievement of peace. This is an achievement that we should all be proud of and protect. That is why I have consistently put upholding the Belfast Agreement at the heart of the UK's approach. Our departure from the EU causes very particular challenges for Northern Ireland and for Ireland. We joined the EU together 45 years ago, and it's not surprising that our decision to leave has caused anxiety and a desire for concrete solutions. We have been clear all along that we don't want to go back to a hard border in Ireland. We have ruled out any physical infrastructure at the border or any related checks and controls. But it's not good enough to say we won't introduce a hard border if the EU forces Ireland to do it, that's down to them. We chose to leave, and we have a responsibility to help find a solution. But we can't do it on our own. It is for all of us to work together. And the Taoiseach and I agreed when we met recently that our teams and the Commission should now do just that. I want to make one final point. Just as it would be unacceptable to go back to a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, it would also be unacceptable to break up the United Kingdom's own common market by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea. My personal commitment to this is clear. As Prime Minister of the whole United Kingdom, I am not going to let our departure from the European Union do anything to set back the historic progress that we have made in Northern Ireland, nor will I allow anything that would damage the integrity of our precious union. So existing models do not provide the best way forward for either the UK or the EU. But before I turn to what a new and better model might look like, I want to be straight with people, because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now. How could the EU's structure of rights and obligations be sustained if the UK or any country were allowed to enjoy all the benefits without all of the obligations? So we need to strike a new balance, but we will not accept the rights of Canada and the obligations of Norway. The second hard fact is that even after we have left the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, EU law and the decisions of the ECJ will continue to affect us. For a start, the ECJ determines whether agreements the EU has struck are legal under the EU's own law, as the US found when the ECJ declared the safe harbour framework for data sharing invalid. When we leave the EU, the withdrawal bill will bring EU law into UK law. That means cases will be determined in our courts, but where appropriate, our courts will continue to look at the ECJ's judgments as they do for the appropriate jurisprudence of other countries' courts. And if, as part of our future partnership, Parliament passes an identical law to the EU law, it may make sense for our courts to look at the appropriate ECJ judgments so we both interpret those laws consistently. As I said in Munich, if we agree that the UK should continue to participate in an EU agency, the UK would have to respect the remit of the ECJ in that regard. But in the future, the EU treaties and hence EU law will no longer apply in the United Kingdom. The agreement we reach must therefore respect the sovereignty of both the UK and the EU's legal orders. That means the jurisdiction of the ECJ in the UK must end. It also means the ultimate arbiter of disputes about our future partnership cannot be the court of either party. The next hard fact is this: if we want good access to each other's markets, it has to be on fair terms. As with any trade agreement, we must accept the need for binding commitments. For example, we may choose to commit some areas of our regulations, like state aid and competition, to remaining in step with the EU's. The UK drove much of the policy in this area, and we have much to gain from maintaining proper disciplines on the use of subsidies and on anti-competitive practices. Furthermore, as I said in Florence, we share the same set of fundamental beliefs: a belief in free trade, rigorous and fair competition, strong consumer rights, and that trying to beat each other countries' industries by unfairly subsidising one's own is a serious mistake. And in other areas like workers' rights or the environment, the EU should be confident that we will not engage in a race to the bottom in the standards and protections we set. There is no serious political constituency in the UK which would support this, quite the opposite. Finally, we need to resolve the tensions between some of our key objectives. We want the freedom to negotiate trade agreements with other countries around the world. We want to take back control of our laws. We also want as frictionless a border as possible between us and the EU, so that we don't damage the integrated supply chains our industries depend on, and don't have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But there are some tensions in the EU's position too, and some hard facts for them to face as well. The Commission has suggested that the only option available to the UK is an off-the-shelf model. But at the same time, they have also said that in certain areas, none of the EU's third country agreements would be appropriate. And the European Council's guidelines aspire to a balanced, ambitious and wide-ranging deal with common rules in a number of areas to ensure fair and open competition. This would not be delivered by a Canada-style deal which would not give them the breadth or depth of market access that they want. And it's hard to see how it would be in the EU's interests for the UK's regulatory standards to be as different as Canada's. Finally, we both need to face the fact that this is a negotiation and neither of us can have exactly what we want. But I am confident that we can reach agreement. We both want good access to each other's markets. We want competition between us to be fair and open, and we want reliable, transparent means of verifying we are meeting our commitments and resolving disputes. But what is clear is that for us both to meet our objectives, we need to look beyond the precedents and find a new balance. As on security, what I am seeking is a relationship that goes beyond the transactional to one where we support each other's interests. So I want the broadest and deepest possible partnership, covering more sectors and cooperating more fully than any free trade agreement anywhere in the world today. And as I will go on to describe, we will also need agreements in a range of areas covering the breadth of our relationship. And I believe this is achievable because it is in the EU's interests as well as ours. The EU is the UK's biggest market, and of course the UK is also a big market for the EU. And furthermore, we have a unique starting point where on day one we both have the same laws and rules. So rather than having to bring two different systems closer together, the task will be to manage the relationship once we are two separate legal systems. To do so and to realise this level of ambition, there are 5 foundations that must underpin our trading relationship. First, our agreement will need reciprocal binding commitments to ensure fair and open competition. Such agreements are part and parcel of any trade agreement. After all, why would any country enter into a privileged economic partnership without any means of redress if the other party engaged in anti-competitive practices? But the level of integration between the UK and EU markets and our geographical proximity means these reciprocal commitments will be particularly important in ensuring that UK business can compete fairly in EU markets and vice versa. A deep and comprehensive agreement with the EU will therefore need to include commitments reflecting the extent to which the UK and EU economies are entwined. Second, we will need an arbitration mechanism that is completely independent, something which again is common to free trade agreements. This will ensure that any disagreements about the purpose or scope of the agreement can be resolved fairly and promptly. Third, given the close relationship we envisage, we will need to have an ongoing dialogue with the EU and to ensure we have the means to consult each other regularly. In particular, we will want to make sure our regulators continue to work together as they do with regulators internationally. This will be essential for everything from getting new drugs to patients quickly to maintaining financial stability. We start from the place where our regulators already have deep and long-standing relationships, so the task is maintaining that trust, not building it in the first place. Fourth, we will need an arrangement for data protection. I made this point in Munich in relation to our security relationship, but the free flow of data is also critical for both sides in any modern trading relationship too. The UK has exceptionally high standards of data protection, and we want to secure an agreement with the EU that provides the stability and confidence for EU and UK businesses and individuals to achieve our aims in maintaining and developing the UK's strong trading and economic links with the EU. That is why we'll be seeking more than just an adequacy arrangement and want to see an appropriate ongoing role for the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. This will ensure UK businesses are effectively represented under the EU's new one-stop shop mechanism for resolving data protection disputes. And fifth, we must maintain the links between our people. EU citizens are an integral part of the economic, cultural and social fabric of our country. I know that UK nationals are viewed in entirely the same way by communities across the EU, And this is why at every stage of these negotiations, I have put the interests of EU citizens and UK nationals at the heart of our approach. We are clear that as we leave the EU, free movement of people will come to an end, and we will control the number of people who come to live in our country. But UK citizens will still want to work and study in EU countries, just as EU citizens will want to do the same here, helping to shape and drive growth, innovation and enterprise. Indeed, businesses across the EU and the UK must be able to attract and employ the people they need, and we're open to discussing how to facilitate these valuable links. Reciprocal commitments to ensure fair and open competition, an independent arbitration mechanism, an ongoing dialogue, data protection arrangements, and maintaining the links between our people. These are the foundations that underpin the ambition of this unique and unprecedented partnership. It will then need to be tailored to the needs of our economies. This follows the approach the EU has taken with its trade agreements in the past, and indeed with its own single market as it has developed. The EU's agreement with Ukraine sees it align with the EU in some areas but not others. The EU's agreement with South Korea contains provisions to recognise each other's approvals for new car models, whereas their agreement with Canada does not. Equally, the EU's agreement with Canada contains provisions to recognise each other's testing on machinery. Its agreement with South Korea does not. The EU itself is rightly taking a tailored approach in what it is seeking with the UK. For example, on fisheries, the Commission has been clear that no precedents exist for the sort of access it wants from the UK. The fact is that every free trade agreement has varying market access depending on the respective interests of the countries involved. If this is cherry-picking, then every trade arrangement is cherry-picking. Moreover, with all its neighbours, the EU has varying levels of access to the single market, depending on the obligations those neighbours are willing to undertake. What would be cherry-picking would be if we were to seek a deal where our rights and obligations were not held in balance. And I've been categorically clear that that is not what we're going to do. I think it is pragmatic common sense that we should work together to deliver the best outcome for both sides. So let me start with how we do this for goods. This is the area where the single market is most established, and both the UK and EU have a strong commercial interest in preserving integrated supply chains that have built up over 40 years of our membership. When it comes to goods, a fundamental principle in our negotiating strategy should be that trade at the UK-EU border should be as frictionless as possible. That means we don't want to see the introduction of any tariffs or quotas. And as the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union set out in his speech in Vienna last week, we must ensure that as now, products only need to undergo one series of approvals in one country to show that they meet the required regulatory standards. To achieve this, we will need a comprehensive system of mutual recognition. The UK will need to make a strong commitment that its regulatory standards will remain as high as the EU's. That commitment in practice will mean that UK and EU regulatory standards will remain substantially similar in the future. Many of these regulatory standards are themselves underpinned by international standards set by non-EU bodies of which we will remain a member, such as the UN Economic Commission for Europe, which sets vehicle safety standards. Countries around the world, including Turkey, South Africa, South Korea, Japan and Russia, are party to the agreement. As I said in my speech in Florence, this could be achieved in different ways. Our default is that UK law may not necessarily be identical to EU law, but it should achieve the same outcomes. In some cases, Parliament might choose to pass an identical law. Businesses who export to the EU tell us that it is strongly in their interest to have a single set of regulatory standards that mean they can sell into the UK and EU markets. If the Parliament of the day decided not to achieve the same outcomes as EU law, it would be in the knowledge that there may be consequences for our market access, and there will need to be an independent mechanism to oversee these arrangements. We will also want to explore with the EU the terms on which the UK could remain part of EU agencies such as those that are critical for the chemicals, medicines and aerospace industries. The European Medicines Agency, the European Chemical Agency and the European Aviation Safety Agency. We would, of course, accept that this would mean abiding by the rules of those agencies and making an appropriate financial contribution. But I want to explain what I believe the benefits of this approach could be, both for us and the EU. First, associate membership of these agencies is the only way to meet our objective of ensuring that these products only need to undergo one series of approvals in one country. Second, these agencies have a critical role in setting and enforcing relevant rules. And if we were able to negotiate associate membership, we would be able to ensure that we could continue to provide our technical expertise. Third, associate membership could permit UK firms to resolve certain challenges related to the agencies through UK courts rather than the ECJ. For example, in the case of Switzerland, associate membership of the European Aviation Safety Agency means that airworthiness certifications are granted by its own aviation authority and disputes are resolved through its courts. Without its membership, Swiss airlines would need to gain their certifications through another member state or through the agency, and any dispute would need to be resolved through the ECJ. Fourth, it would bring other benefits too. For example, membership of the European Medicines Agency would mean investment in new innovative medicines continuing in the UK, and it would mean these medicines getting to patients faster as firms prioritise larger markets when they start the lengthy process of seeking authorisations. But it would also be good for the EU, because the UK regulator assesses more new medicines than any other member state, and the EU would continue to access the expertise of the UK's world-leading universities. And of course, Parliament would remain ultimately sovereign. It could decide not to accept these rules, but with consequences for our membership of the relevant agency and linked market access rights. Lastly, to achieve as frictionless a border as possible and to avoid a hard border. Sorry, let me repeat what I mean by that. To avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, we also need an agreement on customs. The UK has been clear it is leaving the customs union. The EU has also formed a customs union with some other countries, but those arrangements, if applied to the UK, would mean the EU setting the UK's external tariffs, being able to let other countries sell more into the UK without making it any easier for us to sell more to them, or the UK signing up to the common commercial policy. That would not be compatible with a meaningful independent trade policy. It would mean we had less control than we do now over our trade in the world. Neither Leave nor Remain voters would want that. So we've thought seriously about how our commitment to a frictionless border can best be delivered. And last year we set out two potential options for our customs arrangement. Option one is a customs partnership between the UK and the EU. At the border, the UK would mirror the EU's requirements for imports from the rest of the world, applying the same tariffs and the same rules of origin as the EU for those goods arriving in the UK and intended for the EU. By following this approach, we would know that all goods entering the EU via the UK pay the right EU duties, removing the need for customs processes at the UK-EU border. But importantly, we would put in place a mechanism so that UK would also be able to apply its own tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the UK market. As we've set out previously, this would require the means to ensure that both sides can trust the system and a robust enforcement mechanism. Option two would be a highly streamlined customs arrangement, where we would jointly agree to implement a range of measures to minimise frictions to trade, together with specific provisions for Northern Ireland. First, measures to ensure the requirements for moving goods across borders are as simple as possible. This means we should continue to waive the requirement for entry and exit declarations for goods moving between the UK and the EU, and we should allow goods moving between the UK and the rest of the world to travel through the EU without paying EU duties and vice versa. Second, measures to reduce the risk of delays at ports and airports, for example, recognising each other's trusted traders schemes and drawing on the most advanced IT solutions so that vehicles do not need to stop at the border. Third, we should continue our cooperation to mitigate customs duty and security risks. And fourth, measures to reduce the cost and burden of complying with customs administrative requirements, including by maximising the use of automation. And recognising the unique circumstances in Northern Ireland and our shared commitments to avoiding a hard border, we should consider further specific measures. 80% of north-south trade is carried out by micro, small and medium-sized businesses. So for smaller traders, who as members of the community are most affected, but whose economic role is not systemically significant for the EU market, we would allow them to continue to operate as they do currently, with no new restrictions. And for larger traders, we would introduce streamlined processes, including a trusted trader scheme that would be consistent with our commitments. Both of these options for our future customs arrangement would leave the UK free to determine its own tariffs with third countries, which would simply not be possible in a customs union. Now, I recognise that some of these ideas depend on technology, robust systems to ensure trust and confidence, as well as goodwill, but they are serious and merit consideration by all sides. So to conclude on goods, a fundamental principle in our negotiating strategy is that trade at the UK-EU border should be as frictionless as possible, with no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. We believe this can be achieved via a commitment to ensure that the relevant UK regulatory standards remain at least as high as the EU's and a customs arrangement. We recognise this would constrain our ability to lower regulatory standards for industrial goods, but in practice we are unlikely to want to reduce our standards, not least because the British public would rightly punish any government that did so at the ballot box. This approach to trading goods is important for agriculture, food and drinks, but here other considerations also apply. We're leaving the Common Agricultural Policy and will want to take the opportunity that brings to reform our agriculture and fisheries management. The UK has among the highest environmental and animal welfare standards of any nation on earth. As we leave the EU, we will uphold environmental standards and go further to protect our shared natural heritage. And I fully expect that our standards will remain at least as high as the EU's. But it will be particularly important to secure flexibility here to ensure we can make the most of the opportunities presented by our withdrawal from the EU for our farmers and exporters. We're also leaving the Common Fisheries Policy. The UK will regain control over our domestic fisheries management rules and access to our waters. But as part of our economic partnership, we want to continue to work together to manage shared stocks in a sustainable way and to agree reciprocal access to waters and a fairer allocation of fishing opportunities for the UK fishing industry. And we will also want to ensure open markets for each other's products. Just as our partnership in goods needs to be deeper than any other free trade agreement, so in services, we have the opportunity to break new ground with a broader agreement than ever before. We recognise that certain aspects of trade in services are intrinsically linked to the single market, and therefore our market access in these areas will need to be different. But we should only allow new barriers to be introduced where absolutely necessary. We don't want to discriminate against EU service providers in the UK, and we wouldn't want the EU to discriminate against UK service providers. So we want to limit the number of barriers that could prevent UK firms from setting up in the EU and vice versa, and agree appropriate labour mobility framework that enables UK businesses and self-employed professionals to travel to the EU to provide services to clients in person, and that allows UK businesses to provide services to the EU over the phone or the internet. And we want to do the same for EU firms providing services to the UK. And given that UK qualifications are already recognised across the EU and vice versa, it would make sense to continue to recognise each other's qualifications in the future. There are two areas which have never been covered in a free trade agreement in any meaningful way before: broadcasting and, despite the EU's own best efforts in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, financial services. But we have some ideas for how we can do this, and it's in all our interest to explore these. On broadcasting, we recognise that we cannot have exactly the same arrangements with the EU as we do now. Currently, because of the country of origin principle, a company based in the UK can be licensed by Ofcom and broadcast into any EU member state and vice versa. The relevant directive will not apply to the UK as we leave the EU, and relying solely on precedents will hurt consumers and businesses on both sides. The UK's creative hub leads to the development of products that European consumers want. The UK currently provides around 30% of the channels available in the EU. But equally, many UK companies have pan-European ownership, and there are 35 channels and on-demand services which are offered in the UK but licensed in the EU. So we should explore creative options with an open mind, including mutual recognition, which would allow for continued trans-frontier broadcasting, recognising the enriching role that British broadcasters and programme makers play, not only in British but more broadly in our common European culture. Similarly, on financial services, the Chancellor will be setting out next week how financial services can and should be part of a deep and comprehensive partnership. We're not looking for passporting because we understand this is intrinsic to the single market, of which we would no longer be a member. It would also require us to be subject to a single rule book over which we would have no say. The UK has responsibility for the financial stability of the world's most significant financial centre, and our taxpayers bear the risk. So it would be unrealistic for us to implement new EU legislation automatically and in its entirety. But with UK-located banks underwriting around half of the debt and equity issued by EU companies and providing more than £1.1 trillion of cross-border lending to the rest of the EU in 2015 alone, this is a clear example of where only looking at precedent would hurt both the UK and EU economies. As in other areas of the future economic partnership, our goal should be to establish the ability to access each other's markets based on the UK and EU maintaining the same regulatory outcomes over time, with a mechanism for determining proportionate consequences where they are not maintained. But given the highly regulated nature of financial services and our shared desire to manage financial stability risks, we would need a collaborative, objective framework that is reciprocal, mutually agreed and permanent, and therefore reliable for businesses. There are many other areas where the UK and EU economies are closely linked, including energy, transport, digital, law, science and innovation, and education and culture. On energy, we want to secure broad energy cooperation with the EU. This includes protecting the single electricity market across Ireland and Northern Ireland, and exploring options for the UK's continued participation in the EU's internal energy market. We also believe it is of benefit for both sides for the UK to have a close association with Euratom. On transport, we will want to ensure the continuity of air, maritime and rail services, and we will want to protect the rights of road hauliers to access the EU market and vice versa. On digital, the UK will not be part of the EU's digital single market, which will continue to develop after our withdrawal from the EU. This is a fast evolving, innovative sector in which the UK is a world leader, so it will be particularly important to have domestic flexibility to ensure the regulatory environment can always respond nimbly and ambitiously to new developments. We'll want our agreement to cover civil judicial cooperation, where the EU has already shown it can reach agreement with non-member states, such as through the Lugano Convention, although we would want a broader agreement that reflects our unique starting point. And our agreement will also need to cover company law and intellectual property to provide further legal certainty and coherence. The UK is also committed to establishing a far-reaching science and innovation pact with the EU, facilitating the exchange of ideas and researchers. This would enable the UK to participate in key programmes alongside our EU partners. And we want to take a similar approach to educational and cultural programmes to promote our shared values and enhance our intellectual strength in the world. Again, making an ongoing contribution to cover our fair share of the costs involved. In all these areas, bold and creative thinking can deliver new agreements that are in the very best interests of all our people, both in the UK and across the EU. And in the face of a worrying rise in protectionism, I believe such agreements can enable us to set an example to the world. For the world is watching. We should not think of our leaving the EU as marking an ending, as much as a new beginning for the United Kingdom and our relationship with our European allies. Change is not to be feared, so long as we face it with a clear-sighted determination to act for the common good. Nor is Brexit an end in itself. Rather, it must be the means by which we reaffirm Britain's place in the world and renew the ties that bind us here at home. And I know that the United Kingdom I treasure can emerge from this process a stronger, more cohesive nation. A United Kingdom, which is a cradle for innovation, a leader in the industries of the future, a champion of free trade based on high standards, a modern, outward-looking, tolerant country, proud of our values and confident of our place in the world. This is an optimistic and confident future which can unite us all. A global Britain which thrives in the world by forging a bold and comprehensive economic partnership with our neighbours in the EU and reaches out beyond our continent to trade with nations across the globe. The approach that I have set out today would implement the referendum result, provide an enduring solution, protect our security and prosperity, help us build the kind of country we want to be, and bring our country together by commanding the confidence of those who voted leave and those who voted remain. It is an approach to deliver for the whole of our United Kingdom and our wider family of overseas territories. I am in no doubt that whatever agreement we reach with the EU, our future is bright. The stability and continuity of centuries of self-government, our commitment to freedom under the rule of law, our belief in enterprise and innovation, but above all the talent and genius of all our people, and especially our young people, are the seeds of our success in the future, as they have been the guarantors of our success in the past. I look forward to discussing our future partnership with our European friends. Because although we are leaving the EU, and in that regard we will become separate, we are all still European and will stay linked by the many ties and values we have in common. And because it is only by working together that we will find solutions that work for all our peoples. Yes, there will be ups and downs in the months ahead. As in any negotiation, no one will get everything they want. We will not be buffeted by the demands to talk tough or threaten a walkout, just as we will not accept the counsels of despair that this simply cannot be done. We will move forward by calm, patient discussion of each other's positions. It's my responsibility as Prime Minister to provide that leadership for our country at this crucial time. By following the course I have set out today, I am confident we will get there and deliver the right outcome for Britain and the EU. A generation from now, what will be remembered is not the rough and tumble of negotiation, but whether we reached an enduring solution cast in the interests of the people we are all here to serve. So my message to our friends in Europe is clear. We know what we want, we understand your principles. We have a shared interest in getting this right. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Well, Theresa May ending that, well, it was about 45-minute speech, the third Brexit speech, with an optimistic note and a message to the EU, trying to answer the criticism by stating that she does know what she wants. They have criticised her for saying that she doesn't. There are also going to be questions and answers to the Prime Minister now. Let's go back over what she said. She started that speech by returning to what she said on the steps of Downing Street. A country that works for everyone, not a privileged privileged few. That was the template, actually, for the whole of this Brexit speech. She quickly dismissed the existing models for Britain in terms of Norway and Canada. She said they wouldn't work for the UK going forward. And then it was a speech of hard choices. She did actually answer some of the big questions. She said life is going to be different when we leave the EU. We're leaving the single market, which she has stated before, and our access is going to be less. We haven't heard her say that. No, they're not going to be able to have their cake and eat it, which some of the Cabinet had said in the past. She also said that EU law and decisions of the European Court of Justice will continue to affect us in certain instances. And she gave various examples of that. If we pass the same law as the EU, it may make sense to look at what the European Court of Justice has done in the past. She then pointed, though, to some of the tensions that exist for the European Union too. She said that their position is also incompatible. She said the UK has to have an off-the-shelf model, but then also says none of the third country agreements that have already been done would be suitable for Britain. And she said that this is a negotiation that was obviously meant for Michel Barnier, the EU's negotiator, and neither side can have exactly what we want. Again, the first time we've heard that sort of language. Now, there was one statement that may upset some of the Brexiteers, also my guest here in the studio, reciprocal binding commitments to guarantee fair and open competition. How far does she see mirroring the European Union rules and regulations going forward? But in a strong riposte to Michel Barnier's criticism of cherry-picking that the UK can't do, she said every trade agreement is cherry-picking, and in that instance we should be able to find a third way. That has been rejected, of course, by the EU. She said no to a customs union. That will upset some of the Remain colleagues within the Conservative Party. But again, on Northern Ireland, it wasn't entirely clear how she sees this frictionless border working between Ireland and Northern Ireland when it comes to goods going across what she says will be a frictionless border, and no hard border will be erected. But the customs partnership she talked about will mirror EU rules of origin. So she is still looking for a third way, but has actually given ground, if you like to say, that Britain isn't going to get everything it wants. It was a reality check for Brexiteers like you. You're not going to be able to have your cake and eat it. You're going to have to put up with less access to the single market, which was not what was set out by the Brexit Secretary.
What I heard was the most optimistic and positive tone I think I've heard from the Prime Minister in a long time. And I think that the words that came out most from the whole speech for me were reciprocity and fair and open competition. And the fact that she's been fairly clear, exactly that she's happy to be flexible, that we must be flexible, but the EU must too, because we want them to be in as good a place as we want to be, in a different relationship, a deep and special relationship. But that actually she kept reiterating those words, that energy that everyone needs to come to get a situation that works for everyone.
But no customs union. There isn't going to be a customs union in the way that you would like to see. Do you accept that another way can be found to keep Northern Ireland part of the UK but still have frictionless trade across that border?
No, because you talked about two other options, but as far as I can see it, they still do not stop Northern Ireland possibly becoming a back door into the rest of the EU via the Republic of Ireland on standards, on rules of origin. I just don't see how it works, to be quite frank. Either you're in the customs union and you avoid that visible hard border, or you're not, and you will have to have some checks. There are no other countries in the rest of the world, there are no other countries that avoid a border. You know, you've got Sweden and Norway. There are checks on lorries going across that border. You've got Canada and the US. There are checks on lorries going across those borders. It's just not going to fly what she talked about with regard to the two other options. I just don't buy it.
What do you say to that? If there are checks, it will be deemed a hard border.
We will need to see how it rolls out, but I think on all sides, and I think she mentioned in particular the Taoiseach and working with him to actually find a way that can work for everyone so that there isn't a hard border. She's been very clear that's something that is not acceptable.
That's the objective, but there's no clear route to that other than staying in the customs union.
Right, let's talk to the Conservative MP Anna Soubry. She's been a critic of the government's position over Brexit. What was your reaction to the speech?
I think it's to be welcomed in the sense that the Prime Minister is clearly waking up, if you like, to the realities. I think she's always known them, actually. Look, she's facing a very difficult task here. Let's be really, really, really honest.
Well, we know that.
Exactly. So she's got the difficulties that she has within the Conservative Party, and that's a fact. And I think she's beginning to bring people together. If she achieves that, it'll be remarkable, and good luck to her. The other thing she's, I think, now appreciating, or at least she's now talking about, is this huge gulf that exists between what the EU has made very clear is their Brexit reality and where we've been. And I think we are seeing that she is now publicly explaining that, and she's saying, at the moment, the way that she's falling is that we will not have the access that we have had in the past. That's not what David Davis promised.
But do you accept that? Do you accept, in order to have a new relationship, to strike out on free trade deals as a third country and still maintain those high regulations, we won't be able to have the same access? Is that something you could accept?
I'm afraid I do not accept any of these things, because nobody voted to be poorer, and what we are talking about is an acceptance that our economic prosperity will not be as good. And may I just say, it is very important that we lance this boil about these free trade agreements. The government's own analysis shows, even if we got all the free trade agreements that are available, and God knows we've got over 40 already by way of our membership with the European Union, they will not make good the damage that will be caused to our economy by leaving the single market.
But this is a negotiation, as Theresa May has said, and it's a negotiation for the EU too.
Yes,
it's all very well for them to reject everything that's been put on the table so far. But having listened to this speech from Theresa May, would you expect them to move and look more closely at a bespoke deal for Britain?
The really big problem, which everybody misses in this, is that we are now wanting an economic solution, something that keeps our prosperity. The EU do not see it like that.
But every free trade agreement, she said, is cherry-picking, and that's true, isn't it?
Do forgive me. When you have a free trade agreement, both sides want to do the best thing for their respective economies. This is different. This is the mistake that's been made. For us, it's all about our economy, and rightly so, but for the EU, it is a political set of negotiations in the sense that they have to maintain the integrity of the remaining 27 countries. So, by way of example, may I give you this example? This is the big question to be asked. How many German car manufacturers have been to the German government and said, for goodness sakes, do a great deal with the UK because we need it because of our market? Answer, not one. Why? Because they understand the integrity of the single market, and the customs union is absolutely overpoweringly more important. And truthfully, they can continue to get FTAs with other countries that will make good any drop in the sales to our country. And that is the harsh reality we have got to wake up to.
Right, but you must have welcomed the fact that Theresa May said that actually the European Court of Justice will still arbitrate in certain areas.
That's Brexit reality.
But what's that going to do to people like Anne Trevelyan and other Brexiteers?
Anne-Marie is a member of Her Majesty's government.
Right.
So she's not to be seen as some hard Brexiteer, so she supports...
I didn't say she was a hard Brexiteer, but it might be uncomfortable as others like
Brexit,
Theresa...
and Anna voted Remain, but we are both members of Her Majesty's government.
Thank you for clarifying that.
I'm a backbencher, but profound difference, I'm so sorry.
Don't promote Anna Soubry just yet to the government. I'm not sure that would happen anyway. But in terms of Brexiteers, they are not going to be happy with that issue, because they say that we are leaving the EU, we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union. This is what they would say, and we shouldn't have the European Court of Justice overseeing.
We must not any longer seek to tarnish people with the same brush. There are different sorts of people who voted Brexit. So you undoubtedly, within my own party, have the hard Brexiteers,
the ones you wanted
spoken about,
slung out of the party.
Well, actually, I think the mistake I made is in identifying Theresa as the person to have done that. David Cameron, John Major should have done that, but we are where we are. This is more important than that. There are those on the hard Brexit, and then there are many who voted, obviously, to leave, but they are not the hardliners. And I can tell you now for a fact, I have been approached by 3 only in the last week, all of whom voted leave, believe in Brexit, but now are seeing the value of EFTA. And I think that the Prime Minister needs to understand the shift, not just in public opinion, but amongst the backbenchers of the Conservative Party.
Right. Would you accept that sort of shift by the government being part of the European Free Trade Area?
We've moved to a much bigger conversation. The speech has set out exactly the sort of framework that the Prime Minister wants to see for our country for the long term in a new relationship.
How do you bring Anna Soubry on board?
Well, we'll keep working together as best we can.
Right. I mean, do you think it's going to be possible?
I hope so. I think one of the challenges and the beauties of Parliament and sovereignty is that we will get to a point where we can all live with the outcome. It won't be perfect for me, it won't be perfect for you, but it will be, I hope, a position, because that is what Parliament's sovereignty is
Can you
for.
live with it?
Anne-Marie, I am an old-fashioned, pragmatic Conservative. It runs all the way through me. And you and I both know that there are some in our party who are not of that way. They are hardline and they won't shift. This speech, I think, the way she's positioned it, the reality that she's accepted of the judgments of the ECJ, that for me is welcome news. The reality of the difficulties in Northern Ireland. And Emma Reynolds is absolutely right.
OK, well,
there has to be an alternative and none has been forthcoming. Otherwise, it'll be the custody.
What Theresa May has just said in answer to a question post this speech is that no deal is still better than a bad deal. Do you agree?
No. Look, what I want to see, and the European Union is making this absolutely clear, that there are many options that will face us. I say in all good faith, I wish Theresa absolutely all the best in this.
In the way that John Major did when he made his speech.
I'm not talking about John Major, I'm talking...
No, but he also wished her well.
The point I was trying to say was this. I think that this Prime Minister absolutely wants the right thing for our country. She is driven by a real profound sense of public duty. No debate about that. I wish her all good fortune.
But does it worry you that she's saying no deal is better than a bad deal?
Of course it does, because the reality is that when it comes to the withdrawal agreement in October, the EU's made it clear we will still have options. The agreement, or we can stay, or we can become like Norway. It's important that Parliament and the public know there is an alternative to the sort of Brexit that unfortunately is being put forward at the moment. But the PM, her speech is to be welcomed. She's moving in the right direction.
All right.
She's facing Brexit reality.
Anna Soubry, thank you very much for coming in. Emma Reynolds, Parliament is sovereign, said Theresa May, but could reject EU regulations and standards, but then accepted that the UK would perhaps be locked out in terms of access. What did you make of that?
Well, look, I welcome the fact that she has acknowledged that we're not going to have the same type of access to the single market if we do not abide by the rules and if we leave the single market. But I would like her now to spell out what that means in terms of jobs and investment, because according to the leaked report that we saw through the website BuzzFeed, it will mean that growth is going to be less than it would be if we stayed in the single market, and it will mean that there will be a threat to jobs and investment. So I'd like to see her spell out in Parliament when she comes on Monday to do her statement. I will ask her, and maybe Steve Baker, the Minister, could enlighten us to this. It's good that she's recognised that there are hard choices. It's good that she's recognised we won't have the same access to the EU market. What does that mean in terms of jobs and investment?
Well, very conveniently, we're joined now by the Brexit Minister, Steve Baker. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Steve, Theresa May conceded that there will have to be less access to the single market after Brexit. But David Davis, as you will remember, famously promised last year the exact same benefits in terms of access to the single market after Brexit as we have now. Has the government realised, just as Anna Soubry has said, Brexit reality? It's impossible to have that.
The Prime Minister set out an ambitious and credible plan for a deep and special economic partnership, and I think we can be proud of what's been set out. So I think if we go forwards with the plan that she's put there, it will serve our interests and the European Union's.
Right, but do you accept that what was promised to the UK by the Brexit Secretary and others is now impossible?
Well, I accept that the Prime Minister's speech, as set out, should be taken on its own terms.
Right.
She set out how we can have an enduring relationship with the European Union. It's a vision around which the country can unite, and I'm looking forward to delivering it.
Can you actually unite and support the speech and some of the suggestion she made in terms of Britain staying in permanent lockstep with the EU on key areas like state aid, workers' rights and the environment? Were you pleased to hear that? Well,
as you know, we've been on a journey through these speeches where the Secretary of State set out that we're going to be a high standards country. And of course we can accept that because, as the Prime Minister said, there's no serious political constituency in this country to dramatically reduce standards.
Right, and including the European Court of Justice still arbitrating in certain areas post-Brexit.
But let's not get carried away on this.
Well, I'm not getting carried away. I'm just saying as it was in certain areas.
Very carefully to the language
in areas, do you accept that?
I've listened very carefully to the language you've used, but the language which people should refer to is the Prime Minister's, because she was absolutely clear that the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice will end in the UK.
Well, hang on.
And no, that's
her
what
quote
she said.
is EU law and decisions of the European Court of Justice will continue to affect us.
I'm answering your question. So, for number one, the jurisdiction of the ECJ will end in the UK. Number two, Parliament will be sovereign, as the Prime Minister said. But the example that she gave is a very pertinent one. even the United States of America was affected by the ECJ's judgment on safe harbour. And that's the reality of international trade. Of course, when you cooperate with trading partners, their own domestic decisions will have an effect on trading relations, and that is to be expected.
Right, but she did say that Parliament is sovereign, as you have just echoed, but it would also have the right to reject those rules and regulations in the future. So is it your belief that we stay close to them for now, those high standards that you've talked about, but there is the possibility they could be rejected further down the line?
This is a matter for Parliament, isn't it? I mean, this is the point. We're going to become
So that's true, isn't it?
We're going to become a normal, independent, parliamentary democracy operating to high standards with liberty under the rule, under the rule of law, all those things which the Prime Minister set out. And we're going to be on the basis of a normal style of free trade agreement with the European Union, albeit with unprecedented ambition.
Right. I mean, David Davis wrote to Tory MPs this week to say Britain wouldn't pay the £40 billion divorce bill until all of the issues have been resolved. Is that still on the table? Should it still be on the table as a threat to the EU if they do not look at some of the offers made by Theresa May? It's
not a threat. The reality of the negotiations is that it's a principle that nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, and it's as simple as that.
Right, so that is a threat that could actually be reneged on.
Nobody's threatening anyone. We're approaching these talks in a spirit of optimism, expecting to succeed. But the principle which the EU has articulated, and which we also accept, is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Right, no deal is still better than a bad deal. How much planning is then going forward for a no deal?
Well, what the Prime Minister explained there was that what we can't do is accept the rights of Canada and the obligations of Norway. And that is surely something which people can agree to. So, of course, any responsible government must prepare for all possible outcomes, and we continue to do that.
Right. What planning is being done for that?
We have a wide range of plans which run right across all government departments. Where there is relevant work to be done, we are doing it.
Right. I mean, is that still a very real option, then, in the minds of government and ministers like you?
The relevant option, the very real option, is that we move forward now, prioritising the negotiation of an implementation period, which we intend to deliver and which we hope and expect to deliver in March. And once we have agreed the implementation period, to get on with negotiating for the vision which the Prime Minister has set out.
She repeated and articulated a sort of blue skies vision still for the border with Ireland and Northern Ireland. No acceptance of a customs union to get over that issue, as some in Parliament have suggested. How would it work?
So one of the points about the customs union is it doesn't answer all of the questions.
Sure,
because
but answer how she thinks it'll work.
Well, what the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister have agreed is that the first route to solving the set of problems which arise on the border is through our future economic partnership. This is why we need a whole set of mutual recognition agreements which deal with the regulations on each side. It's why we need to have tariff-free access, and it's why we need to have a customs agreement. If we do all of the things which the Prime Minister set out, including mutual recognition of trusted traders, then I believe that we can deliver a borderless, a frictionless border in Northern Ireland.
With no checks, no lorries being stopped at any point at all. It would be totally frictionless.
I am convinced that we can do it. But what I think people need to do is start being optimistic and looking, for example, at the report of the European Parliament, Smart Borders 2.0, and having a really serious think about what is possible if there's the political will.
And you're happy with a future close alliance in terms of rules and regulations with the EU?
Of course, I am happy with the way the Prime Minister has articulated the speech, which is that Parliament will be sovereign, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice will end, and we will continue to be a free enterprise country based on high standards, leading a race to the top. Brexit
Minister Steve Baker, thank you for coming to see us so quickly after that speech. That was the end of Theresa May's third Brexit speech at Mansion House. And it was a pretty wide-ranging and candid speech. I have to say thank you to my guests here. Thank you both for coming in and keeping me company throughout the show. And I'll be back with the Daily Politics at the usual time of noon on Monday. Bye-bye.
I've been getting